Tanks are an interesting thing in League because ever since the first tank meta in Season 6, they've been one of the most complained about things in the game, even after their destruction. During their reign, they created one of the worst years for the competitive scene, and every time they try to address the issue in their items or runes, we get a glimpse of the Dark Ages that makes everyone panic. So since I've seen quite a few comments asking for it, I'll talk about the issues and how I believe everything can be fixed, starting with the first, which is the idea of tanks in the first place should not exist. Essentially, League tries to use the game design holy trinity of tank damage support, but just like other PvP games like Overwatch and Paladins, it doesn't really work because a true tank can just be ignored by the enemy, since they don't provide a threat. The solution for most games is to make tanks a hybrid class of the other two, like Roadhog and Khan or Reinhardt and Fernando, but due to the nature of items and runes in League being a majority of a champion's power, it means that being a tank is more of a choice or a playstyle rather than a champion pick. And this is kind of the core of why tanks shouldn't exist, because they are literally just fighters who are being told how to play rather than being able to choose themselves. For example, imagine the fighter class is Eevee. Players start as Eevee and can choose one of 3 evolutions during the course of the game, being damage, tank, and hybrid. But champions that are labeled as tanks by Riot are literally just skipping that player choice and giving us the evolution. The reason this is the case is due largely in part to the ability power issue that didn't allow for AP fighter items to exist, which is why almost every single tank in the game is based on ability power. Then, during the infamous Season 6 class reworks that tried to realign champions to classes to make the game a bit more stable, they either misidentified the issue or didn't understand, and ended up just taking away their damage and moving all of them to the stereotypical tank role that a game like WoW sees, where their focus is on taking aggro of AI units through CC. The problem with this, however, is that CC is a very unfun mechanic to play against that exists primarily just as a necessary evil in PvP games. Having an entire class centered around CC as their main threat is very unhealthy for a PvP game because it spreads toxicity and frustration and makes the game unfun to play while simultaneously making the game less skill intensive. In addition to this, the design of tanks are also very limiting because in top and mid they have no one to follow up on their CC, and in the jungle they don't have the damage to clear and get set behind easily, meaning their only option is really to support. This is why we saw Riot try to give them higher base values and then scale really poorly, meaning they were kinda like fighters in lane, but then pivoted into just being CC bots in the mid and late game. And this is actually where the Season 6 tank meta came from, where their new class design balance of less damage in favor of more CC broke the game because they didn't fix the items and runes at the same time, meaning Sunfire, Iceborne Gauntlet, and Grasp of the Undying were giving them the damage they lacked in the late game so that they could just get on top of you and stat check you, while having incredible mobility and CC balance that let them permanently stick to you. Same with that horrible meta when Tahm Kench was oppressive, because he had the mobility and CC that most other tanks had, but also had incredible damage that stat checked you from level 1. The issue of their main threat being CC also leads into item poaching issues, where because CC doesn't scale with anything and because they can't really give them damage without making the game extremely unfair, it meant they had to make their items almost exclusively defensive, which created the perfect scenario for anyone in the game to pick them up as a one-off item if they were good. So the solution to this was to make the items a bit worse and just have the champions scaled directly with health, armor, and MR through their kits, so that they could get the full value out of those stats and try to dissuade item poaching issues. But of course, in a majority of cases it doesn't work and really only either limits the freedom of player choice that items and runes should provide and creates a balanced nightmare where those champions are getting stronger offensively through defensive stats. It means that they're essentially just getting double value stats that make them extremely oppressive, which is what we see with champions like Ornn, Rammus, and K'Sante, not to mention how much this influences the counterpick meta by countering champions who aren't very good into tanks. And this is why Riot's solution to this was to then add an absurd amount of anti-tank mechanics into the game, which is why the true damage, % max HP damage, cut down rune, and % armor pens being so good were all pushed into the game, because it counterweights the overpowered tank balance. So then what could we do about item poaching? Well, the answer is simple, which is to add a unique stat that benefits the fighters, notably in their ability to take damage, while dissuading others. What I mean by this is that since items and runes are non-restrictive, meaning you can build almost every item in the game, it means the only thing stopping you is how optimal an item is. This means that there's nothing stopping a champion like Lux from picking up an AP fighter item like Zhonya's as a one-off item and abusing it way harder than an actual AP fighter ever could, because for her it's making up for a crucial weakness, whereas on the intended recipients it simply adds to their strengths. And this is kind of the core issue of item poaching and why it's been so prominent in the game in so many ways, and why the item system is so streamlined and severely lacking, because they don't have really good ways to separate the classes, and if they do, they aren't enforced well enough and not used to their full extent. And I've heard the suggestion of putting hard restrictions, like not being able to build it if you're ranged or something similar, but having only soft limits, like being less optimal, means that people can still have fun and theory craft off meta, which is a dying art form, though I'll admit it wasn't quite alive from the start with how flawed the item system was. And that's pretty much it. Tanks are primarily just AP fighters who were a product of the AP itemization issue that caused Riot to try to fix them in Season 6 by classifying them as tanks, but created many more issues in the process, like the horrible % max HP and true damage influx we see today due to item poaching from non-tanks, and because Riot had to intentionally make tanks overpowered. The problem, however, is that it created a horrible counterpick scenario of, you picked Rammus so I can't play, or you picked E so I can't play. So, to fix tanks, there are essentially 3 solutions. Add AP fighter itemization, push the champion designs back into being EVs, and then add a tank-based stat that still keeps the playstyle of being a tank to limit item poaching for dedicated items.